The scent of an archive is the scent of decaying time, dust, brittle paper, and the faint ghost of bookbinder's glue. To a historian like me, it's usually a comforting perfume, but not tonight. Tonight, the air in the special collections room at Miskatonic University was heavy, charged with something older and less innocent than dust. It sat before me on the solid oak table, the object of my 6-month search. A physician's bag of black leather, cracked with age, with the worn initials engraved in tarnished brass. A.B., the initials of Alistair Blackwood, and beneath them, a single word, Eldridge. The latches were rusted shut, sealed by time and neglect. I didn't have the key, but I had a thin metal spatula, the kind used for separating fragile pages. The first latch gave way. The sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. I waited, holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The second latch popped open. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Disappointment was my first thought. There were no scalpels, no glass syringes, none of the macabre instruments my morbid imagination had conjured. The bag was almost empty. Almost. In a frayed velvet holder, where the tools of the trade once sat, rested 7 identical glass vials. 7. They were small, the size of a thumb, sealed with dark rubber stoppers. But it wasn't the glass or the number that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was what was inside. Each vial held a thick, opalescent, almost milky fluid, and within that fluid, something pulsed, a faint, sick light that waxed and waned in a slow, irregular rhythm, like the last gasp of a candle. I reached out, curiosity overpowering the primal fear that screamed at me to close the bag and walk away. My fingers brushed the first vial. An unnatural, damp cold crept up my hand. Not the cold of the glass, but a cold that seemed to emanate from within it. And with the cold came the sound. A low hum, a dissonant note that vibrated at the base of my skull, a frequency that felt wrong, unholy. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. The hum stopped. The light inside the vial seemed to dim. I looked around at the long shadows cast by the bookshelves, my heart a wild bird in my throat. Silence. It's suggestion, I told myself. Exhaustion. The dust. The human brain is a pattern-making machine, finding ghosts where there are only shadows and drafts. The hum was the ballast in the lights. The cold. My own anxiety. A foolish relief washed over me. A desperate need to be rational, to be the skeptical academic I had always been. But as my eyes returned to the 7 vials, curiosity, now sharper and more dangerous than before, took hold. What were they? What in God's name was Alistair Blackwood keeping so carefully in 1912? I didn't know yet, but a cold certainty settled in my chest. The answer wasn't in any history book. It was right there, pulsing softly, in the palm of my hand. Rationality is a thin blanket on a winter's night. It keeps you warm for a moment, but it doesn't stop the deep cold from seeping into your bones. I placed the 7 vials back in the bag and put it inside my briefcase, feeling its weight as if I were carrying a miniature coffin. The walk out of the archive, through the deserted university corridors, was the longest of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant echo felt like a pursuit. The night air outside had never felt so welcome, a breath of reality in a world that suddenly felt paper-thin. At home, in my sanctuary of an office, surrounded by walls of books that represented logic and fact, the fear felt like a rude intruder. I placed the bag on my desk, under the warm glow of a lamp, and opened it again. The vials looked less menacing here, just curious artifacts, relics of a bygone era. I decided to examine the bag more closely. Perhaps the answer was in some detail I'd missed. That's when my fingers felt it. The bottom of the bag. The velvet wasn't glued directly to the leather. There was a slight give, an irregularity. Using the same spatula as before with surgical care, I lifted the edge of the velvet lining. It came away with a sigh of dust. And there it was, a false bottom. And inside, a single object, a small brown leather-bound journal, so small it fit in the palm of my hand. There was no name on the cover, only the year 1912, embossed in faded gold leaf. My heart leaped. This was what historians call a primary source, a treasure. I opened the journal with reverent care. The script was elegant, slanted, unmistakably feminine. The first few pages were mundane, notes on the weather, the small frustrations of a nurse's daily life at the Eldridge Asylum for Mental Afflictions. Complaints about the long hours, the bland food, the behavior of certain patients. The author's name was Eleanor Schmidt. I kept reading, the narrative subtly shifting. The tone of weary boredom gave way to apprehension. Dr. Alistair Blackwood's name began to appear with alarming frequency. At first it was with admiration. Dr. Blackwood is a man of science, the likes of which I have never seen. His eyes shine with an intelligence that is almost frightening. But the admiration soon curdled into something darker. April 15th, 1912. Today, Dr. Blackwood asked me to assist him in his private laboratory. I was honored. But the place, it is not like the rest of the hospital. It is in the sub-basement past the boiler room. It is cold and silent. A strange, heavy silence. He calls it his acoustic sanctuary. He showed me his equipment, tuning forks of strange sizes, enormous copper coils, and something he calls an anemic condenser. He says he is on the threshold of mankind's greatest discovery. He said the soul is not a spiritual concept, but a resonance, a sonic frequency unique to each living thing. I was fascinated, but I felt a chill that did not come from the cold of the cellar. I stopped reading, my blood running cold. Resonance, sonic frequency. I looked at the 7 vials on my desk, the hum I'd heard in the archive. It wasn't the ballast. It was their sound, their essence. I returned to the journal, my hands no longer trembling with excitement, but with pure dread. May 2nd, 1912. The patient in room 9, Mr. Abernathy, passed away this morning. They all said it was his heart, but I know it was not. I saw him last night. Dr. Blackwood was with him with that dreadful machine of his. He was not trying to save him. He was listening, with a device on his head like a telephone operator. When Mr. Abernathy drew his last breath, Dr. Blackwood smiled, a smile I will never forget, and one of the lights on his anemic condenser lit up with a pale glow. Today, in the laboratory, I saw a new vial on the rack, identical to the other 2 that were already there. The doctor told me it contained a tissue sample preserved for study, but I know what I saw. I saw the light of Mr. Abernathy's life go out, and I saw an identical light flare up in the doctor's machine. I stopped again, gasping. A tissue sample. No, a soul sample. The theory was insane, monstrous. Blackwood wasn't a doctor. He was a grave robber of a kind humanity had never conceived. He wasn't healing bodies. He was trapping souls like butterflies in a jar. The 7 vials weren't samples. They were prisoners. I read for hours, the night deepening outside, my small office becoming an island of light in an ocean of darkness. Eleanor's journal became a downward spiral into madness, Blackwood's madness and her own, for being the sole witness. She described more deaths, always natural, always convenient for the doctor's experiments. The number of vials in the laboratory grew. 3, 4, 5, June 28, 1912. He calls it the Symphony of Silence. Each soul, he says, has a note. Together they will create a harmony never before heard, a harmony that can heal or destroy. He is growing bolder, more careless. The other staff whisper. They talk of the Blackwood touch, patients who walk in and are carried out in a coffin, with a look of peace on their faces that is anything but peaceful. It is a look of emptiness, as if the house is there, but nobody is home. The Symphony of Silence. The phrase hung in the air of my office. It had the weight of an epitaph. Suddenly a loud crack. The lights of my lamp flickered violently and then went out. The room plunged into total darkness, save for the faint, ghostly light emanating from the 7 vials on the desk. I froze. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than the mere absence of sound. It was heavy, dense, like the silence Eleanor described in Blackwood's lab. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint it could have been the blood in my own ears. But it wasn't. It was a voice, thin, reedy, like wind through a crack. Help! I jumped back, my chair toppling over with a crash. I fumbled blindly in the dark for the doorknob, my heart trying to beat its way out of my throat. My hand found the light switch on the wall. Flick. Nothing. Flick. Flick. Nothing. Panic began to bubble up. I was about to run, to stumble through the dark and flee my own home. Then a rational part of my brain, a part that sounded suspiciously like my old thesis advisor, yelled, "Arthur, you idiot. The power must be out in the whole neighborhood." Taking a deep breath, I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The cold, white beam cut through the darkness. I pointed it at the desk. The vials were there, motionless. The pulsing light was gone. They just looked like glass and murky liquid again. I shone the light out the window. Total darkness. The neighbors' houses, the streetlights, all extinguished. A blackout. The relief was so intense it almost brought me to my knees. The whisper, the wind, the crack, a blown fuse. There was a logical explanation for everything. There always was. But as I righted my chair, my hands were still shaking, and I couldn't get that single word out of my head. Help. I spent the rest of the night reading the journal by the light of my phone's flashlight, unable to stop. Eleanor's paranoia became palpable. She started to feel she was being watched, followed. That Blackwood knew that she knew. September 19th, 1912. I know he suspects me. The way he looks at me in the halls. Not with anger, but with interest. Like an entomologist looking at a new specimen. Last night I dreamt of the laboratory. I dreamt I was one of the vials, looking out, unable to scream. The silence was the prison. I woke up screaming, but no sound came from my mouth. The final journal entry was dated October 5th, 1912. The handwriting was nearly illegible, rushed, smudged in places, perhaps by tears. October 5th, 1912. He confronted me today. He knows I took his old logbook. He was not angry. He was exultant. He told me I was the missing piece, that my resonance was perfectly harmonious with the others. He said the symphony was nearly complete, that it needed a conductor, a keeper. He has invited me to the silent auditorium tonight, for the final performance. I cannot go. I must run. I have hidden this journal in his old bag, the one he no longer uses. If anyone finds this, know that Alistair Blackwood is not a man. He is a monster wearing a man's skin, and he steals the silence from souls. My name is Eleanor Schmidt, and I am so afraid. And that was it. The next page was blank, and the next, and the next. Eleanor Schmidt disappeared on October 5th, 1912. Hospital records said she simply left, abandoned her post. No investigation was made. She became a forgotten footnote. I closed the journal. The name, Schmidt. It was my grandmother's maiden name. My heart gave a dull thud in my chest. I grabbed my laptop, the power cord now useless, and worked on the battery, accessing the genealogy sites I used for my research. I typed in the name, the dates. My grandmother had a great-aunt, a sister of her father's who moved to America and became a nurse. A woman whose disappearance had always been a dark mystery in the family history. Her name was Eleanor Schmidt. The discovery brought no clarity. It brought a crushing weight. This was no longer a historical inquiry. It wasn't about a dark secret in a forgotten hospital. It was about my family. Eleanor's blood ran in my veins. Her horror, somehow, was now mine. I looked at the 7 vials. They were no longer just artifacts. They were the tombstones of 7 tortured souls. And could one of them be what was left of my own relative? The question was poison. If Eleanor was meant to be the 7th, or perhaps the 8th, why were there only 7 vials? Her last entry said he had invited her. Had she escaped? Or had his plan failed? Hope was a faint spark. The possibility that she had gotten away gave me a moment of relief. But then another part of the journal came to mind. It needed a conductor, a keeper, and the last line. He has invited me for the final performance. Hope died as quickly as it was born. The story did not seem to have a happy ending. I decided I needed more information. Information that wasn't in the journal. The next day, back at the university, I dove into the newspaper archives from 1912. The news was dominated by the sinking of the Titanic, by political tensions in Europe. But I found what I was looking for. Small notices in the forgotten corners of the local papers. Eldridge Hospital celebrates advances. Articles praise Dr. Alistair Blackwood, his revolutionary work in treating mental illness, the surprisingly low mortality rate on his ward. It was all a facade, a well-constructed lie. I found what I was looking for in a November 1912 article. Tragedy at Eldridge. Renowned physician dies in fire. Dr. Alistair Blackwood had died in a fire that destroyed his private laboratory in the hospital's sub-basement. The cause was ruled accidental, a chemical experiment gone wrong. His body was, according to the article, burned beyond recognition. The hero of Eldridge had met a tragic end. The Symphony of Silence, it seemed, never had its debut. The monster had been consumed by his own fire. A sense of resolution washed over me. The story had an ending after all. A just ending. Blackwood was dead. Eleanor, her fate was still a mystery, but the direct threat had ended a century ago. The vials were just the sad remnants of a monstrous ambition, relics of an evil that had destroyed itself. I felt my duty now was simple, to give these souls a proper burial, perhaps find the patients' names if possible, to return to them the shred of dignity that had been stolen. I took the vials and the journal home that night feeling no longer fear, but purpose, a solemn melancholy. I was the keeper of this secret, and I would give it a peaceful end. I placed the bag on my nightstand. I felt exhausted, the adrenaline of the last 2 days finally leaving me. I fell asleep almost instantly, and then I dreamed. I dreamed I was in Blackwood's laboratory. The cold was the same as Eleanor had described, and I was not alone. The 7 souls were there, not as people but as columns of pale, trembling light, each emitting a low, sad note, a melody of lament, and in the center of the room was the presence of Blackwood. I didn't see him, but I felt him. An absence, a vacuum of sound and heat. He was trying to conduct the symphony, but the notes were wrong, dissonant. The souls refused to harmonize. Then Blackwood's presence turned to me. The vacuum moved in my direction, and I heard his voice, not with my ears but inside my mind, a voice that was cold, calm, and sharp as glass. The conductor's blood, the keeper's blood, the final key, the missing resonance. You brought them home. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The room was dark, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the same heavy silence from the blackout, the silence from the dream. And on my nightstand, the bag was open, and the 7 vials were pulsing softly in the darkness, in perfect, terrifying harmony. They were not just relics, and Blackwood was not dead. He was waiting for someone with Eleanor's blood, waiting for me. The dream did not fade with the morning light. It clung to me like a death shroud, cold and heavy. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to writhe, every silence seemed pregnant with intent. Blackwood's phrase echoed in my mind, "You brought them home." I hadn't just found the story, I had become part of it. I was no longer the historian. I was the final piece of the puzzle. The fear was a physical thing, a knot in my stomach. But beneath the fear, the sick curiosity persisted, now twisted into a desperate need for answers. The conductor's blood? The final key. What did it mean? Eleanor's journal was my only clue. I read and reread the last entry dozens of times. He has invited me for the final performance. She was meant to be the conductor, the keeper. Her blood, and by extension mine, was somehow necessary to unify the trapped souls, to complete Blackwood's terrible symphony, the fire that supposedly killed him. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it was Eleanor? What if, in a final act of desperation, she set the lab ablaze to stop him, dying in the process and preventing the ritual's completion? This theory gave me a flicker of hope. If she stopped him once, maybe I could too. But the hope was a guttering flame. Blackwood didn't feel like a common ghost. His presence in my dream was lucid, intelligent, patient. He wasn't haunting Eldridge. He was haunting the vials. And now, he was haunting me. The phenomena became more personal. The low hum was now a near-constant companion, rising and falling in volume with no rhyme or reason. I heard it in the quiet of my car, in the whir of my computer. I started hearing whispers, fragments of conversations that seemed to come from nowhere. Once, while making coffee, I clearly heard a woman crying in the other room. I ran in, my heart in my throat. No one was there. Just the 7 vials sitting on my desk, looking inert and innocent in the sunlight. Was I losing my mind? Was that it? The stress, the lack of sleep, the macabre story, all of it conspiring to create an elaborate psychosis? I wanted to believe that. Desperately. It would be a relief to know I was insane. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I needed proof, an outside validation, someone who could confirm or deny what was happening. My mind turned to the only other person I knew was connected to this story, even indirectly. The journal mentioned other staff who whispered. Maybe their descendants knew something, some family legend passed down through the generations. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. I spent days buried in census records, birth and death certificates, cross-referencing the names of Eldridge employees from 1912 with online genealogical trees. Most of the trails went cold, but I found one. A janitor named Thomas Mallory. He had a son, who had a son, who had a daughter, and that daughter, Evelyn Mallory, a woman in her late 80s, lived just a 3-hour drive from me. I called her. The voice on the other end of the line was frail, but clear. I introduced myself as a historian researching Eldridge Hospital. The moment I mentioned the name, Dr. Blackwood, the silence on the other end was so profound I thought she'd hung up. My grandfather made me promise never to talk about that place, her voice finally said, trembling but with a core of steel. He used to say some secrets are like diseases. You dig them up, they infect you. That was a trigger. She knew something. I pressed, explained my research, the historical importance. I lied, saying it was for a book to set the record straight. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed to see me. But you come alone, she said. And don't you bring anything from that place with you. I left the bag and the vials locked in my apartment, though it felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. The drive was tense. With every mile that separated me from the vials, the hum in my head lessened, replaced by a rising anxiety. What did Evelyn Mallory know? Her house was small, immaculate, filled with the scent of lavender and polished wood. Evelyn was a tiny woman with bright blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She served me tea and studied me in silence for a long moment. You have his shadow on you, she said at last. The shadow of Eldridge. I recognize it. My grandfather carried it to his dying day. My heart froze. What did your grandfather tell you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She told me the story her grandfather Thomas had told her. He was just a young janitor at Eldridge, but he saw things. He saw the patients going into Blackwood's wing and not coming out. He heard the strange sounds from the sub-basement lab late at night. Not screams, but a low, constant hum. And he saw the fear in the young nurse's eyes. Eleanor Schmidt. My grandfather said she was the only one brave enough to look the devil in the eye. Evelyn continued. He saw her on the night of the fire. She wasn't running from the fire. She was running towards it. She was carrying a can of kerosene she took from the supply closet. She stopped him, Mr. Historian. She burned it all down to stop him from finishing whatever it was he was doing. An immense relief washed over me. So it was true. Eleanor was a hero. She sacrificed herself to stop the monster. So she died in the fire? I asked. Evelyn's eyes darkened. That's where the story gets strange. Blackwood's body was found, or what was left of it, but hers was never recovered. My grandfather was there helping clear the rubble. He said the lab was destroyed, but the inner chamber, the so-called silent auditorium, was almost untouched. And it was empty, but he found something on the floor, a single glass vial, identical to the ones he'd seen Blackwood carry. But this one was shattered, and near it, her journal. My grandfather took it. He read what she wrote. He understood, and he spent the rest of his life afraid. Afraid of what? I asked. Blackwood was dead. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. He didn't believe that. He said the fire didn't destroy Blackwood. It just set him free. That his spirit, or whatever it was tied to his work, to the vials. My grandfather believed that as long as the vials existed, Blackwood existed. He looked for them. He wanted to destroy them. But the doctor's bag had vanished in the chaos. Evelyn stood up and went to an old mahogany chest of drawers. She returned with a small wooden box. My grandfather never found the bag, but he found this in the hospital archives years later, when it was being demolished. It was filed with the original blueprints. She opened the box. Inside, on a piece of velvet, lay a brass key, and next to it a rolled-up piece of paper. It was an architectural drawing, the blueprint for the sub-basement of Eldridge Hospital, and there, clearly marked, hidden behind the back wall of the mortuary chapel, was a windowless room, labeled Silent Auditorium. My blood ran cold. The key, the blueprint. It was an invitation, or a trap. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice hoarse. Because my grandfather believed something else too, she replied. He believed Blackwood couldn't be beaten by force but by harmony, that the souls he trapped were both his prison and his power. He said if they could be set free, Blackwood's anchor to this world would be destroyed. He didn't know how, but Eleanor's journal, maybe the answer is in there. You said you're a historian. Sometimes history doesn't want to just be read, it wants to be finished. I left Evelyn Mallory's house with the key and the blueprint in my pocket, my head spinning. The madness wasn't mine. It was real. Evelyn had confirmed it. The relief of validation was immediately replaced by the crushing terror of what I now had to do. There was no more running. I had the key. I had the location. And in my apartment, Blackwood's 7 prisoners were waiting for me. The drive back was a blur. When I walked into my apartment, the silence hit me like a wall. A heavy, watchful silence. The bag was where I'd left it, but the feeling in the room was different. There was an energy there, a tension that vibrated in the air. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that they knew I had the key, that the final piece of the game was on the board. That night I tried to work, tried to distract myself, but my eyes were constantly drawn to the vials. The light inside them seemed brighter now, more insistent, and the whispers, they were no longer random fragments. They were becoming clearer. I heard names, Abernathy, Eliza, Daniel, and underneath it all, a single word, repeated like a mantra, auditorium, auditorium. They were calling to me, or Blackwood was calling to me, using them as his lure. Exhaustion finally claimed me. I fell asleep in my armchair, Eleanor's journal in my lap, and the dream returned. But this time it was different. I wasn't a spectator. I was Eleanor. I was in the dark corridor of Eldridge, the kerosene can cold and heavy in my hands. The scent of ozone and fear drifted from the laboratory ahead. I could hear the low hum of Blackwood's machine. I knew what I had to do, but when I reached the door, he was there waiting for me. Alistair Blackwood. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a disappointed teacher. Foolish girl, he said, his voice calm and resonant. You cannot burn a song. You only release it into the air. He reached out his hand and the world dissolved into a blinding white silence. The silence of the auditorium. I woke up with a scream caught in my throat. The room was cold. I looked at my desk. One of the vials, just one, was separate from the others in the center of the desk, and the light inside it was pulsing rapidly, frantically, a beacon in the darkness. With my heart in my throat, I grabbed the journal and flipped through the descriptions of the patients. There were 7. Mr. Abernathy, the first. Eliza, a young woman committed for hysteria. Daniel, a war veteran suffering from melancholia, each with a brief, tragic history, but there was nothing connecting them, nothing to explain why they were chosen. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the margins, next to each name, Eleanor had drawn a tiny symbol. For Abernathy, a tuning fork. For Eliza, a treble clef. For Daniel, a musical note. Was she trying to record their note? The sonic frequency Blackwood had mentioned? And then, I saw it. Next to the name of the 7th patient, a man named Samuel, who died just a day before the fire, Eleanor hadn't drawn a symbol. She'd written a short sentence. His song is the key, the only one that resonates against the silence. What did that mean? Was Samuel different from the others? Was his soul the weapon Eleanor had planned to use against Blackwood? The weapon she never got the chance to use? The decision was made. There was no going back. I had to go to Eldridge. I had to go to the silent auditorium. It was the only way to end this. To free Eleanor, Samuel, and the others, and to free myself. I spent the next day preparing, which felt ridiculous. What do you pack for a confrontation with a century-old sonic ghost? I gathered a powerful flashlight, extra batteries, the blueprint, the key, and lastly, with trembling hands, I placed the 7 vials back in their velvet holder in the leather bag. It felt like I was arming a bomb. As the sun began to set, I was ready. The drive to the ruins of Eldridge took less than an hour. The hospital sat on an isolated hill, overlooking the town but utterly abandoned for decades. It was a skeleton of brick and stone, the windows like empty sockets in a skull. I parked my car at the rusted gate and continued on foot. The air was cold and still. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet. The main entrance was boarded up, but I found a broken window on the side. I climbed in. The interior smelled of mold, decay, and sorrow. My flashlight beam danced across peeling walls, overturned furniture, the decades of dust that coated everything. Using the blueprint as a guide, I navigated the labyrinthine corridors. It was like walking through a ghost ship. I could almost hear the echoes of the past. A patient's cry, the rolling of a gurney, a doctor's calm, authoritative voice. I reached the mortuary chapel. It was in ruins. The roof partially collapsed, exposing the night sky. But the stone altar was still there, and according to the blueprint, the entrance to the auditorium was behind it. I pushed against the altar. It moved with a heavy, grinding scrape, revealing a brick wall that looked newer than the rest. In the center, a small rusted metal door with a keyhole that was a perfect match for the key from Evelyn Mallory. The moment of truth. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud, reluctant click. I pulled the door. It swung open with a metallic groan, revealing a stone staircase that descended into total darkness. A gust of cold, stale air rushed up from the depths, air that hadn't been breathed in 100 years. It smelled of silence. I was at the entrance to the monster's lair, and I had to go in. With the bag in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I took the first step down into the darkness. Descending that staircase was like plunging into cold, dark water. With every step, the air grew denser, colder. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls covered in a thin, dark slime. The scent of silence intensified, a metallic, ozone-like odor like the air before a lightning strike. I reached the bottom. Before me, a second door, this one of solid steel, with a large wheel in the center, like a submarine hatch. It wasn't locked. I turned the wheel. The door swung inward without a sound, and I stepped inside. The sound of the door closing didn't echo. It simply died, as if the walls had devoured it. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was a presence, a force that pressed on my eardrums, on my skull. My own breath sounded absurdly loud. My heart beat a war drum against my ribs. I swept the flashlight around. The room was circular, not large. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it was covered in angled panels of a black porous material, acoustic wool, or some forerunner to it. In the center of the room, there was a single metal chair facing a stone pedestal, and on the pedestal, nothing. It was a stage for a performance that never took place. I placed the bag on the pedestal and opened it. The 7 vials seemed to drink the light from my flashlight, the pulses within them slow and faint, like exhausted hearts. The air began to vibrate. The hum. It was back, but not in my head. It was in the room, and it was coming from everywhere. Then, the presence I had felt in my dream manifested, not as an apparition. It was a change in the atmosphere. A spot in the room grew suddenly colder, darker. The silence in that spot deepened, became a vacuum. The presence of Alistair Blackwood. His voice slid into my mind, as cold and precise as a scalpel. The historian, so predictable, drawn to the story like a moth to a flame. You brought the instruments, and you brought the key. Your blood. Panic threatened to paralyze me. I remembered Eleanor's journal. His song is the key, the only one that resonates against the silence. Samuel, the 7th vial. It was my only weapon. With a trembling hand, I picked up the 7th vial, the one that had belonged to Samuel. The other 6 contained a milky light. But this one, the light inside was different. It had an almost golden hue, and the pulse was stronger, steadier. An interesting dissonance. Blackwood's voice mocked in my mind. A stubborn soul, but it will bend, like all the others. They only need the right conductor. The air around me began to ripple. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows danced, forming faces contorted in pain. It was them, the other 6. I could feel their despair, their confusion, the century of torment trapped in an endless silence. Blackwood was using them, projecting their terror into me. My vision darkened. I felt the weight of their pain, the cold of their deaths. It was unbearable. Join the choir, historian. Blackwood's voice hissed. Your ancestor was meant to be the first note of my masterpiece. You shall be the last. I was going to pass out. My strength was leaving me. My mind was fragmenting under the psychic assault. I fell to my knees, the flashlight rolling away, plunging the room into near total darkness, broken only by the light of the 7 vials. It was then that I remembered something else Eleanor wrote. She didn't just draw symbols. Next to Samuel's name, below the sentence, "His song is the key," she had written a short musical notation. 3 notes. Simple, a child's melody. With the last ounce of my strength, I clutched Samuel's vial tightly, and, my voice hoarse and shaky, I began to hum. It was the 3 notes Eleanor had written. The effect was instantaneous. Samuel's vial in my hand glowed brightly, the golden light flaring like a small sun. The pressure in my mind lessened. What is that? Blackwood's voice sounded for the first time surprised. What is that sound? He couldn't hear it. He, the master of sound, couldn't perceive the simple tune. His power was built on complex silence and torment. A simple lullaby, a melody of purity, was anathema to him. I took courage. I hummed louder. The golden light from Samuel's vial expanded, touching the other vials. One by one, the milky light within them began to change, to clear, to harmonize with the golden light. The low, sad note of each soul began to rise in pitch, to find the melody. The lament was turning into a chorus. "Stop it!" Blackwood's voice screamed in my mind, now laced with panic. The vacuum of silence in the center of the room began to writhe, to come apart. "They are mine, my symphony." I struggled to my feet, now humming the tune with all the strength in my lungs. The 7 lights pulsed in unison, a chorus of light and sound that filled the room. Blackwood was losing his grip. The prison he had built was becoming his prisoner's weapon. I knew what I had to do. Blackwood's ritual was to imprison. Mine had to be to release. I grabbed the first vial, Mr. Abernathy's. "Your name was John Abernathy," I yelled, my voice echoing strangely in the dying silence. "You are not a note, you are a soul." And with a cry, I threw the vial against the stone wall. An explosion of white light filled the room, and for an instant, I saw him, an old man, smiling, not with an empty stare, but with gratitude. Then he faded. "No!" Blackwood roared. I grabbed the second vial. "Eliza Miller!" I shouted, and I smashed it. Another burst of light. A young woman, free. One by one, I shattered them. Daniel, Mary, Thomas, William, each name a hammer, each shattering of glass a nail in Blackwood's coffin. The room was a chaos of light and sound, the chorus of the freed souls rising in a deafening crescendo, a true symphony, not of silence but of liberation. Finally, only one vial remained. Samuel's. The key. Blackwood's presence was a faint shadow now, a dissipating echo. I held Samuel's vial high. "Alistair Blackwood," I yelled. "Your symphony is over." I smashed the final vial on the stone pedestal. The light, the sound, the presence, all of it was gone. The silence that remained was empty, normal. The room was dark again, save for the beam of my fallen flashlight. The air was light. The cold was gone. It was over. It was finally over. I laughed. A shaky, half-crazed sound. I was alive. I had done it. The heavy steel door was ajar. The faint light of the moon filtered in from the chapel above. Freedom. I walked out of the silent auditorium, climbing the stairs into the cool night air. Every step was an effort. I was exhausted, physically and spiritually drained. But I was at peace. The shadow of Eldridge, the shadow of Blackwood, had been lifted. I walked back to my car like a sleepwalker. The world seemed new, the colors brighter, the sounds sharper. I had faced the heart of darkness and survived. I started the car and began to drive down the hill, leaving the skeleton of Eldridge Hospital behind to finally rest in peace. I had kept my promise. To Eleanor, to the 7, to myself. The secret was buried forever. I got home as the sun was beginning to rise. The first thing I did was take a hot shower, trying to wash the cold from my bones. The dust of a century. Feeling almost human again, I went to my office. Blackwood's bag was still on the floor where I'd left it. A dark reminder. I decided I would burn it, erase his last trace from existence, but next to the bag was Eleanor's journal, which I had left behind. It had fallen to the floor, open. I picked it up, and that's when I saw it. It was open to a page I hadn't noticed before, a page near the very end after her last hurried entry. The handwriting was different, fainter, scrawled with what looked like charcoal or the tip of a burnt match. It was just a few sentences. It was Eleanor's handwriting, a note made after her final entry, perhaps moments before she set the laboratory on fire. The note read, "The fire will not destroy him. It will only scatter him. He showed me. The symphony does not need a place, only vessels. He prepared 7. But his plan was always larger. He spoke of the eighth vessel. It would not be a jar of glass. It would be the silence that remains. The vacuum left behind. My blood ran cold. The silence that remains." What did that mean? I looked at Blackwood's bag. Empty. The 7 glass vessels were destroyed. What was left was the empty space. Then my eyes fell on my own desk, on my digital recorder, the one I used to log my research notes. I would turn it on and let it run for hours so as not to miss a single thought. I had turned it on when I first started reading Eleanor's journal, and I had left it on when I went to Eldridge. It had been recording the entire time, recording the silence of my apartment, the heavy, watchful silence. With a sense of absolute dread, I picked up the recorder. The red recording light was on. I pressed stop, and then I pressed play. At first, there was only hiss, the sound of my empty room. But then, underneath the static, very, very low, I heard it. A hum, the same dissonant frequency from Blackwood's lab, and then a voice, his voice, crystal clear, emerging from the tiny speaker, and it wasn't screaming or mocking. It was calm, and it was dictating. The eighth composition, the perfect vessel, not flesh, not glass, but information, pure. The silence now has a voice, and the symphony will be digital. The performance is about to begin. The hum from the recorder began to grow louder, to modulate, to transform into something that sounded vaguely like music, a twisted, sickening melody, the symphony of silence. And I realized, with a horror that paralyzed every cell in my body, that I hadn't destroyed Blackwood. I had freed him from his century-old analog prison. I had updated him, and his silence, his sonic virus, was no longer trapped in a ruined hospital. It was on my recorder, in an audio file, ready to be copied, ready to be shared, ready to be heard. What happens when evil goes viral? To find out what happened next, and how the symphony of silence threatens our noisy world. Subscribe and wait for the next broadcast if you dare.